can review them later, or those who aren't able to join us. And number two, Yoni will now put in the chat the link to this week's handout. So we'll ask everyone to take a moment, if you could, to download that. That we'll be referencing throughout our session today. And with that, I want to wish everyone Chag Urim Sameach, happy Hanukkah. I hope it's been a joyous holiday for all of you. And thinking how meaningful it is we're doing this topic on religion and state on Hanukkah for a few reasons. When we think about what Hanukkah means for American Jews, it's often that issues related to religious liberty and religious expression, whether that's having a Hanukkah menorah in public places, which even has made its way to a Supreme Court case in the past we could talk about other times, to this year, there's a whole campaign this Hanukkah shining a light on anti-Semitism that many federations are playing a part of. So again, asserting Jewish rights as a minority in a majority culture. And in Israeli society, the way in which the Zionist movement in Israel has embraced Hanukkah as the return of Jewish sovereignty, Jewish power and control, and this holiday being so important to that. If you put those two ideas together about religious liberty and who has power and authority and control, that really gets at the heart of what we'll be talking about today, the role of religion and state in Israel, and particularly in this current coalition, which has been a fascinating thing to watch. So with that, I'll ask Yoni to start to share the slides with us, and we'll walk through the frame of how we'll talk about that today.
Excuse me, is that handout really 37 pages?
37 slides, yes.
Oh,
yes.
I may not have enough ink in my printer. Okay.
Understood. So most of the slides will be shared, and certainly then you can peruse them later, and we'll be sure to have them on the screen along the way. So just, especially for the breakout groups, we'll take a moment for you to look at the question or the particular idea, so that when we go into breakout groups a few times, as we do each class, they'll have a sense of what that question is. So again, today's topic: how important is religion and state in Israeli politics? Religion and state in a fragile coalition, which we've talked about all along. This unusual coalition, and religion and state can be a divisive issue. How does that play out in 2021 in Israel? So here, a brief review. We've talked about Israeli politics today. We set up the coalition, the economy in class 2, the different aspects of joining or staying in the coalition in class 3. And today's about religion and state, a focus on those issues. And then the last class, we'll look to where the coalition stands a week from today and what issues might arise in the future. And to be sure, religion and state will be a big part of that story, and we look forward to unpacking those issues with you today.
Okay.
Mute.
Yeah.
Low.
Okay.
High.
Okay. I got it.
So here are two quotes about, and first I want to set the scene. If people may recognize where this is in Jerusalem, this is Robinson's Arch, historic part near the Western Wall, which serves as an egalitarian prayer space where men and women can participate equally and sit together for services. And there was a compromise, which we'll be talking about in 2016, which thought about expanding this area, having special entrance and access there to give a sense symbolically that all types of Jews would have a place in the area of the Western Wall. And so you have two quotes that are here. I'm actually going to start with a quote on the right, which is by Rabbi Gilad Kariv of the Reform movement, the first ever Reform rabbi to be a member of Knesset. And here's what he said. Well, actually, I guess I'll read the one on the left because it sets it up. So first you have, on the left, I apologize, Matan Kahana, who's part of the Yamina, the current ruling government, and he's in charge of religious affairs. And there was some discussion of whether to revisit this 2016 compromise, which again, we will talk more about together. But here's what he says about, kind of hinting at he doesn't really want to change the status quo of how things work at the Western Wall. And he makes the following assertion. The vast majority of the Jews in Israel are Orthodox Jews. And therefore, I don't think it's right to give over control of parts of the Western Wall to streams that don't represent the vast majority of Jews in Israel. So again, his assertion, majority of Jews in Israel are Orthodox, and why give it over to groups that don't represent the majority of Jews in Israel? So that's one perspective of the current person in charge of religious affairs. In response, again, is Gilad Kariv, who is a Reform rabbi, ordained Reform rabbi, head of the Reform movement in Israel, and first Reform rabbi ever in the Knesset. Here's his response to that quote. It emerges from Minister Matan Kahana's remarks that he's forgotten that the majority of Jews in Israel are not Orthodox, but rather secular or traditional, and the vast majority support the Western Wall framework and additional compromises on religion and state. It's time for the minister to stop operating in accordance with the incitement by the Haredi parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties, and religious Zionism MKs, Bezalel Smotrich, he mentions, and Ben Gvir, who's also another, one would argue, far-right politically Zionist party, but rather in the spirit of the government and its guidelines, meaning the more diverse government we have today. So two very different visions of religion and state, two very different religions of Israeli identity. How could one say the majority are Orthodox Jews and the other can say, no, that's not true at all? Let me briefly unpack Gilad Kariv's quote, and we will definitely be talking more about this over the course of the session. Notice that he says the majority are not Orthodox, but secular or traditional. So secular, Chiloni, has long been, one would argue for some time, the majority of Israeli society. Today, people would say a plurality of Israeli society, 40% or so. And this other key group being traditional, in Hebrew called Masorti, which means they may be individuals who may belong, if they belong to a synagogue, would be an Orthodox one, but in their own practice tend to be more diverse. Like they certainly would. Families who would light Hanukkah candles, Shabbat candles, etc., but may not be, by some definitions of halachic practice, be strictly Shomer Shabbat or other practices as well. So the question about what is the nature of Israeli identity is at play in this story, which we will talk about, and how there are different definitions of that. So it is about where people go institutionally, like where they belong to synagogue, versus how they practice individually. That's at the heart of a lot of this debate and this discussion. So these two quotes kind of set up what we'll be talking about today. Is this because he doesn't consider non-Orthodox Jews? Thank you for that question. So meaning, does Matan Kahana not consider them Jews? That's an interesting question. I mean, I would say, I don't, we're going to talk more about his interview in a little while. I certainly believe that he is someone who would say that by halachic standards, certainly if anyone was born of a Jewish mother, he would recognize them as Jewish. The question to which, what power and control the institutions of Reform and Conservative Judaism, what voice should they have in government and religious affairs, is another matter. So I don't think it will be about the Jews themselves, but notice it's giving control over parts of the Western Wall to streams that don't represent the vast majority of Jews and Israel, not individuals, but the streams. That's the issue at play, is should these movements have any government recognition, funding, voice, are very much at the heart of what we'll be talking about today.
I'll jump in just for one
please.
second, and we will circle back to this. There has been a lot of debate about this last piece of what Kahana said. Did he mean to say exactly as your question suggests, that he doesn't see those Jews as Jews? And there are those who have suggested, I don't know if Kahana himself has said this or people who have suggested this on his behalf, but that what he really meant to say was that don't represent the vast majority of Jews who go to the Kotel on a regular basis in Israel, and that's actually what he meant. And actually, there are political scientists who have actually said that is something people need to take seriously. That particular question, which we'll circle back to a little later. So there we go. Okay, I was trying to change the channel. There we go. Okay,
great. That's very helpful. Yeah, Yoni, for adding that. Thank you, and we'll circle back to that. And it's a nice segue to the video we're about to show you. This comes from Naftali Bennett, and according to Naftali Bennett, in 2013, when he was the religious minister, he made this video about his vision for the place of what the Western Wall should be for all Jews of all different streams and backgrounds. So we'd like to play this video for you now, because it'll set up in a very interesting way what life was like on religion and politics in 2013 and what is like today in 2021. So Yoni will set that up for us. We'll watch and then we'll discuss briefly.
We're opening a new Azara called Azarat Israel. Until now we had a men's plaza, Azarat Gvarim. We had a women's plaza, Azarat Nashim. And today what you see here, very new, from literally today, Azarat Israel, open for families, open for all of the people of Israel, for all of Am Israel. I want to show you around. What we see over here is the Western Wall. It's the direct continuation of the known Western Wall, which is just about 100 feet north. As you come along, this was the Western Wall of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. The temple was where all of Am Yisrael, all of the people of Israel came up 3 times a year. They would bring their families in order to pray to God. The temple itself was up there. What you see down here was sort of the Wall Street of Israel back then. It was an area of commerce, many shops. People would come with their family to do some shopping, and then they would go to the mikvaot, the ritual baths, before they were about to pray. The Jews back then and today would go into the mikvaot and then go up to the to the Temple Mount and pray. Today, for the first time, you have the opportunity to see what they did back then. The stones you see here, come over here, show these big stones that have been toppled. In the year 70 AD, when Titus, the Romans, came and destroyed the second temple, they pushed the stones from up there, and these are the actual stones that were part of the Western Wall 2,000 years ago. So I invite all of you, all of Am Yisrael from all around the world, and I don't care if you're Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, be it what you may, come over with your families, come and pray here, come and pray at the regular Western Wall or the new area, and connect to Am Yisrael. Thank you very much.
So that's a video he's offering again in 2013 as the religious affairs minister. And it's important to have that in the background as context as we get into the story of what may be transpiring today around the Western Wall.
This year, around Hanukkah time, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about
Hang on for
an
one
interesting notion.
Just trying to clean things up. Hang on for one sec. Almost.
Okay. Good. While you're doing that, I wanted just to follow up on a quote from Rick, the comment from Rick in the chat to be sure I understood. The second sentence I understand, the Orthodox community is a small percentage of the total of Israeli citizens, but the majority of Israeli citizens are not Jewish. Could you just want to understand more of the comment there, Rick, if you'd be willing to clarify? You can put in the chat or say later if you'd like. That's okay. So just I wanted to understand that part because the majority are Jewish. But go ahead, please. Oh, I thought you were about to unmute. That's fine. So you're welcome to clarify in the chat, or we can come back to that point later. Would be fine. Either way is totally fine. Now Yoni has here quoted, you can see on the right, the Bennett, the senior minister, support a Kotel agreement, meaning returning to an idea of revisiting an expansion of that area or enhancing the facilities there, making it possible for an entrance there. All of that is under conversation. And that's come back in recent weeks. Just a couple weeks ago, you can see the tweet below. 8 years ago, then Minister of Religious Affairs, Naftali Bennett, announced the opening of the egalitarian space. His government is now planning to finalize the deal with the progressive streams. That's the idea. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So Matan Kahana, we saw the beginning of the quote. We're now going to extend it a little bit further. So this is the person today. He's part of Yamina, the same party as Naftali Bennett. He's now the religious affairs minister in 2021. So the first sentence will be the same, but notice what he goes on to say. The vast majority of the Jews in Israel are Orthodox Jews, and therefore I don't think it's right to give over control of parts of the Western Wall to streams that don't represent the vast majority of Jews in Israel.
Oh my
I
God.
don't necessarily support the 2016 compromise proposal. It must be studied to see how we resolve the religious wars surrounding the Western Wall. In the end, I think we must end the disagreement surrounding the Western Wall without giving over control of any kind to denominations that represent a very small minority of Jews. So again, he's making that argument in the context of Israeli society. And by the latest numbers in Israel, if you were to add together Reform and conservative Jews in Israel, who live in Israel, maximally 5% of the population. Something that's even a bit high. It would be about 5% at the maximum. So he's not wrong about that part about being a minority of Jews. The question is about voice. Who has a voice? And when the Israeli government, that being the state and the nation state of the Jewish people, are they responsible to listen not only to voices within Israel itself, but to voices in the diaspora who care about these issues when they visit, when they travel, or just symbolically, what does it mean for Israel to be a home to Jews of all backgrounds and types? That's in part we'll be talking about today. But what's interesting is the same person who we just quoted, here's what he said in 2016. We need to look again at reviving that arrangement, which was widely agreed upon, and to stop all the conflicts. So there was a moment in time in which this person, Matan Kahana, was closer to Naftali Bennett and said, yeah, we have to think more broadly, expansively about the solution. So with that, we want to just give you a moment to go into breakout groups and think about what might have changed. Why might he have been taking the position now that there should be no compromise? And 5 years ago, he thought very differently. What are the different possibilities? You can think and hypothesize broadly. especially if you had the opportunity to send around the interview that we sent, you may have some speculation and some ideas there that you want to share and think about from hearing more of his voice, why he might have changed his position over time. So that's what we'll be doing next, is going to break our grips and think about this question. How could he have one position once and another the other time? Yoni's now made them, so we'll give you a few minutes for that conversation, and we'll return to hear what you have to say. Okay.
Okay, so I think, let's see, screenshots. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. So you have the next one. Oh, you have the.
Just break our group, just the next slide, and then I'll turn it to you.
And then I will do the overview of the compromise. Yep. That makes sense.
That's right.
All right. All right, should we give him one more minute?
Yeah, keep it. I think about 1 minute is fine.
Yeah.
Come back to other issues too. That's right.
Okay. What do you have after this? A busy day.
Hanukkah party at TVZ tonight. That's the main other activity. Yeah, so just getting ready for the week, and the new unit in 10th grade on Iran.
Oh, you're starting Iran.
Yes.
Oh, that's right, because they're almost over this semester. Hey.
Yeah. Yes, we just finished the India unit. Iran will take up to break, and then it's like a real mini China unit. It'll be
Yeah.
the January time.
Had the India unit went okay?
Yeah. Oh, I think very well. Really well.
Great.
Yeah, I was very pleased how very some small things I would change about how we contextualize some of it, but what they did with
Whoops.
DBQ.
Hello, I mistakenly pressed return to session prematurely, and I was in the middle of saying something to the group, but
Oh no.
hello.
We'll
Hello,
give you a
hello.
chance when everyone comes back. That's fine.
Yeah, really. I was really disturbed by the quotes by Kahana and in that article. I mean, really disturbed. The man's talking out of both sides of his mouth, and oh my. Yeah.
I hear you. Yeah, we'll process that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big part of it. I would say one of the key reasons that we're teaching this class is to try to understand why you have so many different groups seemingly speaking out of so many different sides of their mouths at different times. So I mean, that's
Yeah.
the inside baseball of politics. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So, and on this issue, as you will see, he is far from the only one who changes his positions and changes his positions pretty quickly over a short period of time. So
Yeah.
Okay, we missed me and Roberta were slow coming back. So what?
you didn't miss it. You didn't miss anything. No, but Bonnie, John, and I were just catching up on a few things. So we'll come back together. Go ahead, John. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's open it out to the full group. We'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas. How might Matan Kahana have one set of views in 2016, different in 2021, based on this situation, what you read in the interview? Any thoughts or ideas about that? Well, we might explain it. I'll start with Roberta and David, and then we'll do Judy second. So Roberta and David, please.
Well, I guess the question occurs to me is, although he seems to be expressing something different from the leader, if you will, of his own party, is that really true? So just because Naftali says, hey, there's a little piece of property over here around the corner, that all you people from the rest of the world should show up and pray at, that wasn't in the plaza, right? So is that not perhaps a compromise itself that doesn't undermine the interests of the Orthodox to have control over the Kotel itself?
Great place to start, and that'll connect very nicely to what Yoni will be presenting next about what the compromise is all about. Judy, please.
Just to say what may be obvious, that he's defending himself from his main attackers, who are the Haredi, and tried to say, look, I'm doing these things that are consistent with this coalition. I'm working on kashrut certification. I'm working on conversions. And I want to keep talking about other things. But look, here, I can draw this line, so don't worry about this for now.
Excellent point. You're right, because he has prioritized the other issues of kashrut and conversion and not this. And that may stand in the way of him being able to achieve those goals. Very good. Other thoughts or observations? What might be playing out here?
He wasn't even, I've got one. 4 years ago. I'm not sure he was in the Knesset.
I've got one.
Yes, Rick, please.
Shir Tikva has had 2 temple trips to Israel. Many of us have been on family trips to Israel, where the groups in the people in the groups include many people who are not Jewish at all. And the idea that they should be they can go to the wall and not have the people in their group be with them is counter to the Shir Tikva viewpoint on the world and many families' viewpoints on the world. And up until recently, they would have to be separated, men and women even. Okay. So this idea that Bennett has making it open is a good thing, but the Orthodox response is we represent a very small minority of the total Israeli citizens in Israel, and we want to control it.
Oh, I see. But yes. And sadly, we saw on all day of all days, Tisha B'Av, the fast day this summer. And that's the day that marks the destruction of the temples. And it's a day that the rabbis teach is a day about Sinat Chinam, causes hatred, where sadly that plaza was taken over by those who do not want it to continue in its current form at all for a brief period of time. So yes, so the you were mentioning could be part of the story too. Yes, Bonnie, please.
Regardless of the orthodoxy establishment saying, oh, reform and conservative are a small number, the overall approach seems to be to prioritize religion over secularism. And to me, that's a fundamental question. Does Israel need to be in all its aspects a religious society, or can a Jewish state be just Jewish as a comprehensive term of peoplehood, and have religious and moderately religious and secular if they want to be?
Beautifully put, and really core questions to what Israel has been about and the relationship of diaspora to Israel. And I know we'll be saying a lot more about those questions going forward. So thank you. Paula, and then I think with that, it'll be a good time to transition to our next part. We will definitely continue to delve into those questions. Paula, please.
Yeah, I find it really offensive that they don't, even if they want religion to be prominent in Israeli society, that they don't acknowledge, support, and see as valid more liberal forms of the religion. That's so offensive to me. We don't count.
I hear you. And we are definitely going to give some of our last session over to the relation between Israel and American Jews, how it connects to politics, because that's really at the core of why we have this class, why we're learning, so we can think more deeply about that question and think about those who make that assertion where, the past prime minister was caught both on and off the record making remarks to that effect. And it seems like Naftali Bennett's trying to turn the page away from some of those remarks. Prime Minister Netanyahu was dismissive at moments of liberal streams of Judaism in ways that Naftali Bennett is different, in part because of his own biography and story. So with that, let's go back to the slides. And thank you for all that you've raised. I think it really sets up nicely a lot of this class. We'll just note this one slide very quickly, which is that the Shin Bet, the security services in Israel, have boosted the security of this religious affairs minister, Matan Kahana. One could speculate about the whys. We have why would he need increased security? How threatening is he seen? So putting aside now the Kotel issue, but back to the other areas where he is making major headway and promising major reform around kashrut and conversion. Why might that be seen as threatening to key constituencies in Israel? I'll just leave that as an open question for you to think about that we will return to over the next set of slides. So with that, I will pass it over to Yoni to take the story forward.
So one of the interesting conversations we had before everybody got back was with Bonnie. I'll just relay it to everybody who was reflecting on trying to understand why it was that Matan Kahana could have been, to quote Bonnie, speaking out of both sides of his mouth, which I think is a fair assessment. In 2016, he seems to be in favor, and now he's not. And so what's going on? And much of that has to do with the inside baseball of politics. We were sort of reflecting on that. And, what was good for him in 2016 may not have been good for him in 2021, or vice versa. And what we're about to see in this next section, just framing what we're about to look at, is going to be true not just of Kahana, but of several other groups as well. We're going to look at actually several groups who shift positions on the issue of the Western Wall. So we're going to use the Western Wall and the issue of who has access to, who doesn't have access, et cetera, to really get behind the scenes, to pull back the curtains on the inside baseball of Israeli politics. That is, after all, the major theme of our class is trying to understand how the Israeli government works behind the scenes. So we're going to now look a little bit more behind the scenes of the Kotel, the Western Wall, and see who has taken which positions when and what that all means. All right, so what's the backstory? So we're starting with this image that long predates the state of Israel, and as you can see here, this is a picture from the Kotel, from the Western Wall, where both men and women are praying together. You can see the men have what looks to be some kind of liturgical thing. Maybe it's a siddur, it's hard to tell. Could have been Tehillim. Whatever it is, the men and the women are together. There's no mechita. There's nothing between them. And that was generally true, and not generally, it was true at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, really right up until 1929. It was just accepted as a matter of course that the wall was not meant to be an Orthodox or any sort of necessarily prayer space. It was a place that you went to go to reflect and to have your own spiritual outreach to God or whatever you wanted, but was not going to look like a synagogue today. When they tried to add a mechitza, a separation between men and women in 1929, it actually was a key factor that led to rioting by Arabs in Jerusalem at the Kotel and around the Kotel, because it was seen by the Arabs, that move of putting a mechitza down, of putting a separation down, as less of a religious act. They don't care if Jews pray separately or together, but more of a political act. That this was Jews establishing a permanent sort of prayer house, a synagogue, if you will, in this location, which was seen by the Arabs as a political move by the Jews to assert themselves over this area. And so we're going all the way back to 1929, who controls this piece of real estate, and in what way those people use religion to control this piece of real estate is seen very much as an act of politics as it is anything else. And so that's an important backstory for all of this. All right, so we're going to flash forward now to modern times, and you can see you could see the name of an organization, a key organization that has really been fighting more than any other group to create spaces for denominations other than Orthodoxy, and particularly for women. There's an organization called Women of the Wall. They go back to the late 1980s. And so they are women who are Orthodox, Reformed, Conservative, Renewal, Reconstructionists, etc. As you can see from their website, they say, second paragraph down, Women of the Wall not only seek to empower in group prayer and Torah reading at our most sacred site, but also strive for recognition of our prayer service by the legal and religious Israeli authorities. So again, you can see the politics there too, for the sake of all Jewish women. Our group, with a membership that is not only multi-denominational, but spans the political spectrum, embodies a message of tolerance and pluralism. We're going to circle back to this because Shmuel Rosner, who is an important observer of Israeli politics, has a lot to say about that particular idea, the intersection of feminism and religion in Israel and where that all comes from. We'll circle back to later, but a lot of that is actually in many ways revealed by these two polls that you can see here from the AJC, and you can see that if you look at the poll on the left, do you support or oppose a mixed gender prayer area adjacent to the Western Wall administered on equal basis with the services of the wall itself? And you can see that in America, 73% American Jews, 73% are in favor of that, and 21% oppose it. And you can see on the question on the right, do you support or oppose the existence of a square adjacent to the Western Wall that would serve for mixed prayers without separation between men and women? And in Israel, 42% say yes and 48% oppose. So this, in many ways, is an issue that is divided on some level, at least, by where you live, Israeli Jews versus American Jews. American Jews tending to see this in much more favorable terms than Israelis. All right, so that's a little bit of background. What happens next is fascinating. So there had been actually in the Supreme Court, we'll just very quickly catch you up. In 2002, the Israeli Supreme Court, the Beit Mishpat Elyon, actually ruled that the separation of men and women was without just cause, and needed to be resolved. And they quickly reversed themselves. The Supreme Court did in 2003, and said, well, actually, it's okay to have the status quo as it is, because any sort of move towards opening things up, allowing women the space to pray, women wearing tefillin, etc., having Torahs, it endangers public safety, they said in 2003. And so that put the issue of who would have access, et cetera, back into the hands of people like the Women of the Wall. And really from 2003 all the way up till 2017, I'll tell you about the next Supreme Court ruling in 2017, which is fascinating in a moment. In between then, between 2003, when the Supreme Court said, no, status quo is okay because it endangers public safety, anything other than that, in 2017, the ruling I'm going to tell you, in 2016, the forces aligned, and we'll look back at why those forces aligned and how they came to be in a few moments. But what you need to know for now is that in 2016, forces aligned to create a compromise. And the compromise we will look at in a moment. But it's interesting to note that one of the key people to push for that compromise was Natan Sharansky, who is famously Soviet dissident who comes over and becomes a leader in Israeli politics as well, who pushes for the compromise. And I think the best way to tell you about the compromise is to look at the image of what it was going to, what the compromise was going to be. So, so you can see there are three different zones. So the zone in purple or pink or whatever, I'm not very good at colors, fuchsia, I don't know, whatever that color is over to the left is the space that most people associate with the Western Wall, with the Kotel Plaza. And so as you can see, there is a mechitza down about it's hardly down the middle, about 2/3 of the way over. This is the men's section, this is the women's section. And so that is where the plaza is today. And this section over here is this shaded in blue, is the piece that in 2013 that Naftali Bennett was showing us. That's the area over here. He was standing like right around here. And he was pointing, if you remember, he was pointing over the gate where you could see all the rubble, the stones from the destruction of the Second Temple way back in the Roman period. And so this area was going to double in space, and was going to be a much larger area. So that was the compromise. And as several of you have pointed out, maybe not much of a compromise at all. And in fact, in 2017, well, actually, before I get to 2017, I'll tell you what ultimately happens is the compromise falls apart. We'll look at that in a moment. All right, so I'll pause right there. I see a hand has gone up. Judy, you have a question or comment about what you're—
Yeah, just a quick question.
Yeah,
A very
please.
quick question. How was that area to be accessed?
Okay, so I will now jump ahead and tell you what the Supreme Court said in January of 2017, which is moments after this. The Supreme Court said that from any practical perspective, this is not access. That this is at least access to the Kotel. Now you can see here that you would access it through bridges and walkways. You could access it through. Can you see? I can't see if my cursor is showing how you get there.
Yes.
But you would access it through a series of bridges that would get you over what would otherwise be impassable areas into that area over there. And the Supreme Court said that it's got its own access point, so therefore it's its own area, A, and B, it's blocked to a large extent by rubble, etc. So you don't have the same kind of access to the wall as the purple area does. So you're right, Judy. That was one major concern that people had.
Yes. Oh, Yoni, another question that emerged in the chat, if you could speak
Yes.
to, is why
Please.
did the Supreme Court say it was a safety concern in 2000?
Oh, right. So back in 2003, what did they mean by a safety concern? What a great question. I didn't fill in the blanks there. Basically, what they were alluding to was the fact that whenever new denominations would assert themselves in one of the areas and try to have davening there, that would be a reformed service of the Torah. That would be women wearing tefillin. That would be any number of things that were not orthodox, that other groups would show up, largely groups that were, we would associate with the Haredi community, either the United Torah Judaism or what was then called Degel HaTorah, the Ashkenazi Orthodox Jews, or the Sephardi Orthodox Jews that affiliate with Shas, back and forth. They would sometimes do it together, sometimes separately. They would come and they would do all sorts of things. So John alluded to one example that happened during this most recent Tisha B'Av. And in other incidents, it would get even worse than that. There are some really repulsive moments of them throwing bags of feces at worshipers, certainly hurling all sorts of other insults, and on a regular basis, just being both verbally disruptive and oftentimes physically disruptive as well. And so the Supreme Court said, this is unacceptable. We can't have that sort of disruption. And in the name of keeping the peace, let's just keep the services orthodox. And so that was, Marina, I'm seeing your face, not in necessarily agreement with the Supreme Court ruling. If you want to jump in, go right ahead. Yes.
I'd like to say that this is supporting terrorism, abetting it because it is Jewish. So this is exactly a terrorist move. Like we would throw things, and instead of saying we are not standing for terrorism and will fight it and we will arrest you and will put you in jail for disrupting the peace, they say, we'll meekly admit to it. I mean, this is like horrendous.
Yes, and that was not lost on a lot of people, including two people we're going to look at in a bit, namely Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett. Both of them see rulings like this as deeply problematic for reasons that we're going to get into. But you're absolutely right, Marina. People were absolutely horrified by this ruling. It's giving in. I don't know if everybody necessarily used the word terrorism, but yes, it certainly for a lot of people looks like that. That you're giving in, and that if maintain quote safety at the cost of what? Like what are we giving into at that point? Exactly right. Okay, any other questions before we move on? John, I can't see the full screen, so I don't know if you are able to see.
I think that was it. That was the other question in the chat. So I think you can go.
Okay, so what happens? So in 2016, it seems like we're at a compromise. Bibi Netanyahu goes along with it. You have leaders, Orthodox leaders like Naftali Bennett, who are going along with it. We saw his video before. Here's a picture of him very proudly showing off this new area over here. Everybody is very excited about this new this idea. So, of course, today, things look, I'll very quickly say, so that compromise in 2016, we'll jump forward. It's like that compromise in 2016 falls apart. It falls apart mostly, and it won't surprise you. The first part won't surprise you. The second part will. It falls apart mostly because key groups in Bibi Netanyahu's coalition, namely the United Torah Judaism and Shas, say, if we move forward with this compromise, we are out of the government. And so they threatened to collapse the government. So the question is, how, if that is true, how did the compromise get as far as it did to the point where everybody thought that this was a sure bet? We'll circle back to that in a few moments, because that is a really interesting question. All right, taking us to today. So I promise, I know it's a little confusing jumping back and forth. We'll come back to that in a few moments. Jumping to today, we now have a new government. We are 5 years later, and for reasons that we have discussed in our previous class, and we can continue to get into now, there is a new political climate. There are new political realities on the ground, and we are now talking about the reviving of this once stalled and many people thought left for dead compromise. So you have Naftali Bennett, who said in a pre-Shabbat Facebook post just a couple of weeks ago how excited he was to revive this compromise. And what I love about this, John and I were reflecting about this, is that you have, for the first time in Israeli history, a prime minister who is writing pre-Shabbat Facebook posts. So obviously there's the technological excitement of that you have this thing called Facebook, but really that he's issuing pre-Shabbat, that you have a Shabbat observing prime minister here, who is also espousing these kinds of compromises, is a very, for many people, an exciting development for many Jews. The same prime minister, by the way, who ensured that when he was in Sochi, and was detained because he had a much longer meeting with Putin than he thought, made sure to get himself a minion in Sochi, same thing in Washington, D.C. That same guy standing in front of Robinson's Arch saying we're going to have compromise and that men and women will daven together here in this space. Okay, not surprisingly, you have groups like Shas, the Orthodox Sephardi party. You have Noam, who is a far right-wing political Zionist political party, largely based in Hebron, etc., who opposes, also very religious too, and of course United Torah Judaism, the Haredi right-wing Ashkenazi groups, who are saying there are no problems at the Western Wall, nor is there any need for dialogue. The Western Wall is not the Carmel market. It is not open for negotiations. They said, this is from today. As hard as it is for you, Prime Minister Bennett, try to stand for what you wrote. Don't touch the Holy Western Wall. Don't change anything there. Suddenly, you'll discover that there's no deliberate campaign. There are no polls, there is no fundraising, and there are no serious instances of paranoia. The declarations by Lapid and Lieberman that they intend to charge on with the offensive Western Wall deal, and the law for conversions, not, and we'll come back to what those are, not according to Jewish law, are a declaration of war by the government of Israel against the state's Jewish character. And we were saying earlier, I think Judy, you had said, I think Judy, it was you mentioned earlier about what exactly is the character of this state? Is it a Jewish religion that is the essence of the state, or is it a Jewish peoplehood that is the essence of the state? And so clearly, here's Aryeh Deri, who is the leader of Shas, who is taking his position on that. But they are on the outside. They are on the outside looking in. So they can scream all they want, but do they really have any power? That remains to be seen, because yet again, we've seen scuffles and physical violence that has taken place now. Whereas on November 5th, on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, the new moon is Rosh Chodesh. Is oftentimes when you have special prayer services, when Women of the Wall and other organizations go specifically to the wall to daven, and there were physical scuffles that took place at the wall. But again, do we care? Does that matter? How important will those acts of physical violence be? Again, it remains to be seen, as will the coalition currently, as it's constructed, continue to support the Kotel deal, the compromise. Because as we can see, the religious minister, the minister in charge of religious affairs in Israel, Matan Kahana, not so sure he wants to do it. He's backing off, as is Zev Elkin, who is a former Likud bigwig, who is now, he was like many Likudniks, because of Netanyahu, bolted the party to join other parties. He joined Tikva Chadasha, Zev Elkin did. He's the Minister of Jerusalem Affairs. So he obviously has a lot at stake in maintaining what he believes, and again, coming back to this discussion, what does it mean to maintain peace and security? But in maintaining peace and security in Jerusalem, where the Kotel is located. So Elkin has his own political agenda as well, in terms of why he wants to oppose it. So you have a leader, a rather significant leader inside the government, who is saying he opposes this compromise as well, as does Ayelet Shaked, who is another important leader as well. We haven't gotten, I couldn't find an exact quote from her, but it's been reported that she opposes the compromise too. So how strong this compromise will be and whether or not it's going to be able to move forward is up in the air. And again, it has everything to do with positioning. Who is positioning themselves for what inside the government, and what's going to make most sense for them. And what's interesting, one last word about Zev Elkin. Paul, I see your hands up. I'll come back to you. Is that Zev Elkin himself is from the Ukraine, and oftentimes it is not universally true, but has oftentimes been true that many of the political leaders in Israel who have roots in the former Soviet Union generally tend to be opposed to religion having too strong of a hold in Israel. We've seen that with Lieberman, Sharansky, etc. So the fact that Elkin, with his own political roots in Ukraine, is actually standing in favor of the religious status quo here is fascinating and worth paying attention to. So, Paula, yes.
So I think answered my question a second ago. So when he says it should be run by the state of Israel, he's talking about the Orthodox state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little contradiction when he says not the Reform Conservative or the Orthodox. He's essentially saying the Orthodox rabbi should run it in their control power spot. It's a little contradictory.
Yeah, it's, and Paula, what you're getting at, and it's absolutely fascinating, goes back all the way to 1948 when the state was founded, when a critical agreement was made between the prime minister to be David Ben-Gurion and the Orthodox groups, the major Orthodox groups. Basically, he makes a deal with them. You support the state of Israel, because many on that Orthodox right-wing spectrum were a little iffy. Are we going to get behind you? Are we going to have to go to the UN and maybe shake some trees? We don't know what. So he says, you join us, you go along with us, says Ben-Gurion, and we will create what's called, he writes a very famous letter called the status quo letter, that we will give you, Orthodox rabbis, control over major aspects of religion in Israel. And it was called the status quo because up until that point, the Orthodox had asserted themselves and rather successfully managed to create spaces for themselves within the state to be, including kashrut inside of government buildings, major role in Shabbat observance, like where you wouldn't be allowed to have public Shabbat violations, education, etc. So he gave them, the Orthodox, control over religion in this status quo agreement, and that is largely, it hasn't been, we're already starting to see that break down a little bit in the most recent budget, for example, who gets to control kashrut. But that has largely been the reality on the ground for the existence of the state. So when we talk about the state of Israel, the Orthodox, controlled by the Orthodox, has been conflated with the state of Israel. And so you're making a really, really important point. And it is worth really getting into as well. So Roberta and David, I'm not sure which of you has their hand up. Yeah.
Usually me.
I've got a question.
Well, this may be because of the particular challenges of having a religion, especially a religion like Judaism, part of, the governmental legal structure. But it also causes me to wonder, how does a government run through a parliamentary democracy get anything done ever?
Yeah, it's a great question because, especially when the political winds shift as quickly as they do, depending on who was in your coalition, who's not in your coalition, who is angling for what, new parties being formed. It really is remarkable. You're absolutely right. And so it's, when we look, people are getting very excited about this compromise. But David, to your point, there are lots of people saying, wait 5 minutes and this may not exist anymore, because we saw what happened in 2016. And I still have one more thing to show you about what happened in 2016 that I think will further your point. So you're exactly right. What happened in 2013, though, and I know it's confusing to keep jumping around, we will come back to this. What happened in 2013 might give you a little bit of hope. So we're going to come back to that a little bit later in our class. But David, there might be something that happened in 2013 that might give us a little bit of hope today. So let's hold on to that. So, but it's a really important point you're making, David. Yeah, Andy.
You may be getting to this. I don't know where this class is going to end up, but isn't the Western Wall a wedge issue? And the reformers really want things like reform of marriage and divorce, and reform of who's buried in cemeteries, and funding for the reform and conservatives. So are we going to discuss those things? And the Western Wall is just there because it's so easy to make an issue out of.
You're making a really, really important point, because the Western Wall doesn't have a key feature that a lot of the other religion and state issues do, like funding for education, for example, like who will serve in the army. And that has everything to do with what happened in 2013 with a really interesting moment of coalition building there. And so Andy, I think you're getting at a really important point, which is also why for many Israelis, the wall isn't nearly as important as other issues in religion. It's an issue for Americans. So yes, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. Okay, so one last point, and I'm going to turn it back over to John. The goal of this particular section has been to show that as far as, and I think, Andy, to your point, that as a wedge issue, the ground underneath who can and can't be in the Western Wall shifts constantly in Israeli. But for the past 5 years, who has and who has not supported the wall and the compromise has changed all over the place. And it has everything to do with people's positioning for political power, where they know they want to go next, who is in your coalition, who is not in your coalition. And so in many ways, the wall has been a pawn. And that takes us to our punchline. Jumping back to 2016. It is important to note that the Western Wall Compromise was originally promoted by Bibi Netanyahu. We know that, with the silent consent of the ultra-Orthodox, that the UTJ and the Shas had agreed in 2016. They didn't outright say it because you can't really say things like that out loud, but they had basically said to Netanyahu, go ahead, you may have this compromise. You can do it, we won't get in your way. So why they then shift not long after that and then vocally say, sorry, Bibi, we're not with you anymore, pull the compromise, that happens a couple months after, is a fascinating question. Of course, why they agreed to it, yes, at first, has a lot to do with money, that we're going to do some trading here. You're going to get some things you want. You're going to get some things we want. Why they shift has everything to do with their local communities. When they found out about it, turning to UTJ leadership and Shas leadership and saying, what have you done here? And you start to see a lot of this happening. And so UTJ leadership has to back down. And so it's fascinating to note that among all the players who have shifted their position on the wall, United Torah Judaism and Shas can be counted among them as well. So, so as far as religion and politics go, and the fragile nature of coalitions, there's no better case study to examine that than the Western Wall. So we're now going to turn our attention to what's going on today and to try to understand whether or not things have changed today or whether things are actually much like they had been for a while. So we're now going to jump back in time, and John's gonna set that up for us now.
Okay, thank you. So the question we like to phrase is there something new at play here now in 2021 when it comes to this religion and state debate? Where is our continuity? Where does it sound the same as the past, and where might it be different? So on this slide, we'll briefly outline a few of those areas, and I'll set it up briefly, and then we'll continue to play out these different theories. One big theory is as follows. At moments when the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is lower on the agenda, we can talk about the good and the bad and why that happens, but at times where that's not the center of what people are talking about, when one looks historically, that's often when these religion and state views become more into focus, more into center. So what is new now that might be bringing some of that to the fore? One is that certain political figures, and particularly Avigdor Lieberman, who I'll talk more about in a moment, have made that the centerpiece of their particular campaigns and parties for a variety of reasons. And this issue is one of the main reasons why we had 4 elections over the past 2 years, and why Prime Minister Netanyahu was not able to form a government, and why instead we have the coalition government we have today. More on that in a moment. Secondly, what's clearly new, it's the first time since 2013, 2015, and if you go before that, 4 decades where there was no Haredi party in the government. So the difference between being in the government versus being in the opposition is huge when it comes to these issues. In 2013, issues related to the Haredim were big in Israeli politics, and that short-lived government of 2013 to 2015 did push forward certain initiatives and ideas. They relate to other issues mentioned earlier around kashrut and Shabbat and conversion and burial, divorce, and many other issues that came to the fore in that era. But what's clearly the same is in a moment you'll see a lot of the same players who were in government in 2013 are in this new coalition government today. So how does that play out in terms of what they were saying then versus being what's said now? And this idea about religion playing a defining role in who Israel is as a state. So you see both continuity and change for these elements. Now let's go through them each at a time. Avigdor Lieberman, who comes from Moldova, who made Aliyah to Israel in 1978. So he comes before the biggest wave of Jews of the former Soviet Union, who come in the early 90s and afterwards, over 1.5 million. But because of his timing, he comes at the age of 20 making Aliyah, goes to Ulpan, gets very involved in politics on the college campus with Likud, and that sets him up perfectly that he is really beginning his career, just as the rise of the number of Jews of the former Soviet Union are coming to Israel. And he positions himself well to be such an important force in Israeli politics. And what's clear is that he was involved in party politics, which is true of any immigrant group. How do we best secure the funds and the integration of our immigrant group into Israeli society? And over time, it's always been there since the beginning, as you'll see in a minute, but religion and state becomes more and more his focus, and the focus of what he perceives is important to his community, namely the Jews of the former Soviet Union who are coming to Israel. And we like to unpack why and how that's the case. And that, so here we have maybe Yoni, if you could expand, zoom in a little bit so we could see the 10 a little bit more clearly. Yes. Terrific. Thank you. Yes. So there are many issues that are here. This is a top 10 of Lieberman's party called Yisrael Beitenu. Israel is our home. That's what the name of the party means. It was a second party of the Jews of the former Soviet Union. The first one was by Natan Sharansky, the famous refusenik. Yisrael Ba'aliyah, so really the immigrant party. The immigrant party to Israel was the first one. And Lieberman breaks away a little bit on security reasons. He does not think that Sharansky's party is hawkish enough on a lot of security questions when it comes to Israel. But what's also clear here too, if you look at some of the items, such as number 7, yes to Judaism, no to religious coercion. That's a part of Lieberman's plan. Openness of Judaism, not being coerced to any particular way when it comes to Jewish life. It's on the top 10, so it's there, but it's you see that it's number 9. It's not the very top, because number 1 is security policy based on initiative, preemptive action, solution to the conflict with a comprehensive regional issue, and so on. And death penalty to terrorists. I mean, look at the top 4, all about security. Religion, it's there in 1999, but it's not at the center of what Lieberman is trying to accomplish. Let's move on to the next slide, if we could. But by 2019, that clearly changes, because if people say Israeli politics is all about security, if Avigdor Lieberman had decided which coalition to join or not based on security, Prime Minister Netanyahu would have a 5th term without question. But because he withheld his 5 seats alone on issues of religion and state, and again, Yoni, if you wouldn't mind zooming in just a little bit to the text, so we can see what I read it. Here's what he says in September 2019. So the first of these 4 cycle of elections. We will not concede on passing the ultra-Orthodox conscription law in its original format. We will not concede on the demand to repeal the mini-market laws. We will not concede on demands for public transportation on Shabbat. We will not concede on demands for civil marriage, and we will demand the inclusion of core curriculum studies in the ultra-Orthodox educational system. These are our preconditions. Until we hear words in this spirit, there is nothing to talk about. In this case, it means nothing to talk about with Netanyahu. He's demanding of Prime Minister Netanyahu, you must give some compromise, something on these issues about religion and state, or no deal. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu did not do that, and it didn't make sense for him to do that, because in Netanyahu's mind, his most loyal followers have been the Haredi parties, especially in early years. There was no way he was going to break on these issues. So Lieberman says, well, tough luck. If you're not going to give, I'm not helping you to form a government. Right? And so the second paragraph, we want a normal country in which the citizens will live in accordance with the principle of live and let live. I don't ask to open grocery stores on Shabbat in the predominantly ultra-Orthodox city of Bnei Brak, like in an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, and I'm not prepared for stores to be closed on Shabbat in Ashdod, period. Meaning, let's let each local community, based on its character, decide what it wants to do, not make blanket rules for the entire country when it comes to religion and state. So Lieberman's played a key role in pushing this issue to the fore. And again, as a reason why we have this set of elections going forward. Okay. And now I'm passing it back to Yoni to take the story forward. Yes. Okay.
So one of the key questions that we're trying to understand is why the revival of the Western Wall compromise in 2021 has something changed, is something new, etc. And also getting back to David's question or point earlier about the shifting nature of coalition government and how do we get anything done. I'm going to take us back to 2013, because in many ways, the government that we're seeing today, this government that has reasserted this compromise from 2016, is not entirely, but it looks a lot like the government did in 2013. So let's see if there's continuity, change, etc., from that moment. So 2013. Why is 2013 special? And this is a political scientist in Israel debate whether 2013 was a major change election or not. But it certainly, in many ways, looked like it in reality. So there are two major newcomers on the political scene happened in 2013. The first is a fellow named Yair Lapid. You may have heard of Yair Lapid. Is the son of Tommy Lapid, who was a Hungarian immigrant who is also in his own right a major Israeli politician. Yair Lapid was I think we introduced him in our first class, was a TV journalist, TV superstar in many ways. You could say he's got that TV face. He's got dulcet voice. Just love listening to the guy talk. He has weekly columns here and there. He's a very, very popular journalist. Decides in 2013 he's going to run for office, and he does so largely representing. Not to get too narrow about it, but yes, the wealthier middle class populations of, let's say, Tel Aviv. He says famously in this election that the Israeli middle class is no longer going to be the ATM for the rest of Israel. You cannot just go to the middle class, take money out, and give it to everybody else. What is he referring to? We'll come back to that in a few moments. So he runs for middle class, what he's calling middle class values. His party Yesh Atid, by Yesh was the party designation for his father Tommy, and so he's picking up on that and honoring his dad. Anyway, so Yesh Atid said we're going to avoid talking about the peace process. We're going to shrink that discussion, and really what we're going to focus on are economic, what they call, bread and butter issues, but bread and butter for middle class issues as well. And that really was going to be his major focus. And if we are going to talk about the conflict, it's going to really be about reviving the peace process. Okay, but that's not really going to be his major focus. So he runs in 2013, and so does our friend Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett, who had a long career before this inside the Likud party, he was the chief of staff for Bibi Netanyahu, etc., has grown weary of what he believes is the dictatorial style of Bibi Netanyahu, both internally inside the party and also outside the party as well. And so he runs independently as well. And Yesh Atid in this election wins 19 seats, which was for many people a really shocking development. They ran second in the election, right behind 30. We'll tell you what happened, who wins the 31 seats in a moment. But the fourth most vote getter was this brand new party called Habayit HaYehudi, the Jewish House, which is the brand new party of our friend Naftali Bennett, who get 12 seats. So you have 19 seats for Lapid, 12 for Bennett, and then 31 seats for Likud, who ran that year with the party Yisrael Beitenu, who's Lieberman's party. So Lieberman, our friend Avigdor Lieberman, who we saw, who John told us about, starts to see his influence waning. The Soviet Jews no longer are the same constituency they once were, creating the same sorts of blocks. They have splintered into other places, and so he doesn't necessarily, Lieberman, have that same level of support anymore. And also, Netanyahu's support has been slipping as well, largely because of the rise of other parties that, like Sharon's party, Kadima, who had been really powerful. So Sharon had been slipping. So they decide to join forces, Lieberman and Netanyahu, and they get 31 votes, which is 31 seats, which is good enough to win him a plurality, but certainly not enough to win them a majority. All right, so why do we care about all this? We care about all of this, and here's one of the most fascinating developments in modern Israeli political history. Lapid and Bennett turn to each other and they say, hey, we, and we'll tell you what it is in a second, care about a few things that we want to make sure both of us can get done. So what if we do the following thing? We know Bibi is going to turn to one of us because your 12 votes or my 19 votes, along with the 18 seats of Shas and the and UTJ, the Haredi parties, will be enough to put him over the top. That'll be enough to put him over the top. But all he needs is one of us, either Bennett or Lapid, to put him over the top. along with the Orthodox parties. But you know what? We actually can leverage this. So what if we agree, they say, that neither one of us will agree to join the government unless he asks us both. Only one? Nope, both of us is the only way we're going in. And they both stand firm on that. Netanyahu tries to splinter them by giving them plum assignments, etc., and they won't break. It got so, they were so tight, Netanyahu and Lapid and Bennett, that the Israeli press started referring to them using words like bromance, yet again showing the American influence in Israel, the bromance of Lapid and Bennett. So, thinking about today, this happens in 2013. So the question is, what do they have in common so deeply rooted? What do they care so much about that they were willing to tear the government apart over it? To say, neither of us will join unless both join. So what is it that they both care about? So what they both care about are two things. One, they both have a strong sense of what it means to be loyal to the state. And that means either loyal to the state because you're not going to tear the government apart over religious issues. And to them, Haredim can do that. And so, yes, Arabs can be disloyal to the state. Certainly Bennett sees it that way. And Lapid sees the Orthodox as being disloyal to the state. And so they both have a strong sense of what it means to be loyal to the state. But the other thing they both have in common, and if you remember back to Bennett's to his campaign ad from this most recent cycle, and what Lapid ran on this one, is middle-class economic issues. They both care deeply about that. And as far as both Bennett and Lapid are concerned, the Orthodox have been sucking money out of the government, out of the pockets of middle-class Israelis for way too long, and that needs to stop. And so their stance on the anti-religious position has largely been around economic issues. So important to them that they're willing to neither of them join the government unless the other one joins with them, because they thought together we can get things done. And they actually succeed. And they get Netanyahu to go along with both Lapid and Bennett in the government, and because of that, Shas and UTJ ain't going to be in the government. And so they're not in the government, and with 68 seats, including some remnants of the old Kadima party join the government, they get the following things done in 2013-14. They get the budget passed. So there's some continuity. Both 2013 and today get a budget passed, and that involved cuts to many of the economic benefits that Haredim had relied on for so long, like child benefits, daycare discounts, daycare without having to work, low-cost housing without any work obligations, etc. So these are all budget items that were largely benefiting. It wasn't just Haredim, but to a large extent, Haredim were taking great advantage of those sorts of economic benefits are now going to be cut from the budget, as we're going to be funding for education as well. And in the new budget included requirements that if you want government funding, you darn well better start teaching core subjects and proving that your students have learned those core subjects, such as English, Hebrew, and math. So that is also a part of that budget as well. And those were Bennett and Lapid achievements of the 2013 budget. What's the context of all of this? Taking us back, we looked at this last week, not just in Israel, but worldwide, but certainly in Israel. You have protests all over the country, particularly in 2011, over the failing budgets, over inability for people to just remind you what the sign says. I have cottage cheese. Now all I need is a refrigerator and an apartment in which to put that refrigerator. And so these were what were called the cottage cheese protests in 2011 and happening in Lapid's beloved city of Tel Aviv. And so that really wakes up and gets people's attention. And so they start seeing religion and state as, in many ways, an economic issue. And they make it so in the 2013 government. And of course, you start to see Lieberman's shift on this as well. His first grasp at a life raft was to join Bibi, but that doesn't last very long. He joins Bibi and wins and saves him politically in this election. But Avigdor Lieberman is going to see that his wagon is not going to be well hitched to Bibi's star, because Bibi's star is not heading up. And so Bibi actually, Lieberman sees that the path forward might actually be the Bennett and Lapid path. And Lieberman thus starts to take on a much more strident anti-religious tone as well. So we are, so it's just worth thinking for a few moments about what has changed and what has stayed the same from 2013 to 2015. So just love to hear any thoughts. We'll just stop and take questions or thoughts for now before we get to our last part of today's class. Roberta and David, I see a hand from one of you guys, whoever that is. Go right ahead.
Sorry, it's me again.
No, we love it. Go for it.
Tries to shut me up, but she failed. So I'm going back to a point Marina made about Orthodox terrorism. It strikes me that one of the reasons for what we see is a very public resort on the part of the ultra-Orthodox to violence is perhaps partly due to frustration from being outside the government and having these, bills that are being considered to limit their prerogatives. The problem is that they're resorting to this violence in the Kotel, and they seem to be getting away with it.
Yeah, right. And I think ultimately, right, so there's both a level of optimism in what I'm hearing you say, and also for those who want to remove the Haredim from the political equation, and also reason for concern. The optimism there is that if this indeed is, and I think there is truth here, a last gasp, a sense of desperation on the part of Haredim, that's where the violence is coming from. It's a sign that that they understand that the political grounds have shifted to the point where they are no longer secure with their hegemony, and I think they're right to be feeling insecure. And so David, I think you're right about that. And then the question is really going to be, to what degree is Israeli society going to put up with it anymore? And that your violence will only be as successful as there is fertile ground in which that violence can happen. And if enough of Israeli society says stop it, and however they push back against it, that obviously remains to be seen. But that we have not yet seen the stomach on the part of enough Israeli politicians to push. Sorry, I got to get my cord to push back on it. So you're right, David. In that instance, we have to see where that all goes. So that's a good point. Yeah, Paul, I think you were.
Yeah. What I haven't heard anything about is the legal, ethical issues of Netanyahu that seem to not be affecting this whole equation much, or how much does it affect things?
Oh boy, what a great question. Yeah, so that is undoubtedly the backbeat of much of this. So many of these coalitions have stayed together because of trying to avoid giving Netanyahu the government back. There's also bills that are working its way through, or several, actually a few working their way through the Knesset to whether or not to ban people who are under indictment for being able to run again, et cetera. So that's a big part of the equation as well. And yes, where Netanyahu fits into all of this is a big part of this equation. So you're exactly right.
Is that part of the discussion about whether people have issues with his character?
Are people discussing that?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's
Yes.
yes. Oh, yes. Go ahead, John. Yeah.
I mean, there have been some star witnesses the past week in Israel who've been revealing what has it been like to work with him, and that's definitely generated conversation. And the big domino to fall, everyone is waiting, is will there be a challenge to his leadership in Likud, and when will he leave the scene? It certainly won't be quietly, it seems, but once that day happens, let's say he loses the next primary, decides to resign because of this, the court proceedings, other circumstances like that, the thinking is this current government won't hold, and very quickly, a more right-leaning government would come together around a different Likud leader. That's open speculation that many people have, and we will definitely can talk more about that in our last class, speculating about the future of Israeli politics.
And who the rising stars may be, because as we in 2013, everybody was talking about Bennett and Lapid. We might be talking about people like Yudi Edelstein and others in the future. So we'll introduce you to some of them. But yes, absolutely, his Netanyahu's both his dictatorial style and the ethics of it are the reason that you have all of these people that we've named today: Zev Elkin, Ayelet Shaked, Naftali Bennett. The list goes on and on and on, who are no longer in the Likud party. So, yeah. Bonnie, yes.
Differences between 2013 and today. It seems that in 2013, it was almost a given that Likud would form a government, and all these other parties would be shuffled around to try and see who's going to be part of the coalition. But it seems, at least from what we were getting in the press, that in 2021, people were rallying around being sure that they wanted to get rid of Netanyahu. And what concerns me is, all right, so they had this overarching goal, which they succeeded in. But what kinds of political considerations are bringing these parties together? And what about the politics of compromise in this kind of situation? So basically, what's happening now that they have gotten rid of Netanyahu?
Great question. I mean, and this in many ways has been the backbeat of our past four classes. How many different pieces are affected by that desire to keep me out of the government? Be it, how far will Meretz and Labor go in allowing for all sorts of, moves against the Palestinians to happen, or in religion and state, who is willing to compromise in order to keep those things? You're absolutely right. Those are really, really important questions. Yeah. So, John, do you want to take more questions? Or do you want to do a quick wrap?
Yeah, let's take Judy's question, then Roberta and David. And I'll just say again, Bonnie, perfect setup for next time. The questions are amazing. We will definitely address those next time.
Absolutely.
So Judy first, please.
Yeah. I'd like to go back to the theme of violence and how it plays out. And of course, as Marina said in the chat, this begins with the Rabin assassination and the shock and despair of the Israeli public at that. Even people who were not, supporters of Rabin just couldn't believe that a Jew would do this. My impression is that the shock and the despair have just completely diminished and maybe disappeared as there have been more and more incidents of violence at the Kotel, but in the West Bank and some other ones as well, in Beersheba. And I mean, this is not a rare thing, it seems like, anymore, but I'm not there. Do you agree that it's not so shocking anymore? It's just kind of become a tool of politics?
Can't be good.
Ooh. Yeah, that's a great question. I can say also, to add to your question, there was a huge debate when after Rabin was killed as to whether or not we should have been surprised by this, given what we'd seen in various, calling him Hitler, calling him, a murder, or somebody who's chasing you, trying to kill you. You have the religious right and obligation to kill somebody who's chasing you. They called Rabin a chaser, a pursuer, that you have the right to kill. Added on to that, this idea of the Haredi communities throwing rocks and defending their hegemony through violence was long predated. The use of it predated Rabin's being killed. So we were saying like this has been part and parcel of Israeli politics for going back, and so we shouldn't have been surprised. So that's, you're raising a great point though, as to what degree do even more Israelis accept violence as just what happens sometimes? It's a good question. It's a really good question. Yeah. Roberta and David, yeah.
This time it's me.
Yes.
Actually, relating to what we're just talking about, the violence and the rise of violence and the continuation of violence. from the ultra-Orthodox. I think there is also an ambivalence in secular Israeli society that contributes to the, I don't know if acceptance is too strong, or but certainly the tolerance for some of this. And I wanted to bring that up because having a lot of family in Israel who are secular middle-class Jews, what I sense from them is a feeling of guilt is perhaps too strong a word, but a sense that after all, the ultra-Orthodox are doing work that we're not doing. They are praying. There is this sort of gut feeling, even though they don't want to do it themselves, that they are, in a sense, better Jews. And it's a very strange kind of ambivalence. Because on the one hand, there is anger towards the exploitation of the middle class by the Haredim and by the ultra-Orthodox. On the other hand, there is this sense that we need them, they're doing the work we're not doing.
Yeah, and I think that gets also, David, to your question. Your concern is now for how long are we going to, or will the non-Haredi who don't like the violence be willing to put up with it? And I think, Roberta, you're actually getting at a really, really important psychological component. I've heard many Israelis say things like, "I'm not going to stop eating my cheeseburgers, but when I die, I'd better be buried by somebody who's Orthodox, because otherwise I ain't going where I want to go," kind of thing. And I think you're exactly right. And that's one element of it. That's really good. Yeah. I think that unfortunately, I think, I want to make sure that we have a chance to wrap up. John, you were gonna
Well, I see that Rick has been waiting patiently, so I'll just say this. I'll give Rick the floor and we'll wrap up, which is the slides we didn't get to today. We invite you to look at those for next time. So the slides, it's 31 to 37. And those are mostly questions that I think Bonnie raised the question right at the beginning. What does it mean to be Jewish in Israel? Is it religion? Is it a national cultural identity? You'll see some slides on that. And all of that will set up perfectly our class for next time, which is about what is the future of this coalition, the future of Israeli politics. And certainly you're welcome to email us directly, or again, I'll put my email in the chat so you have it. If you have particular questions you'd like us to get to in this last class about the future of Israeli politics, here's my email, and Yoni can put his. And I'll give Rick just a moment to pose his last question or comment, and then we will wrap up for today. Rick, please.
Okay, I'll try to make it quick. First, we're assuming that Israel is a Jewish country. Well, if we make that assumption, then the Orthodox community, they should have their kids enlist in the IDF. They should pay taxes, which I think they don't now, and they should not be getting government subsidies that are not applicable to other people. That's the first point. The second point is that if it's a Jewish country, yet there are Muslim and Arab members of the Knesset, and there are other people in the government who are not Jewish. And then the last quick point, if I believe that a female Israeli Jewish citizen should have access to Jewish religious sites. One of them is the Western Wall that right now is not necessarily confirmed. The second is the Dome of the Rock, where the cave in the rock people believe is where the Holy of Holies of the temple was. And the third is Hebron, where the graves of the matriarchs and patriarchs, which is in the West Bank. They're not providing equal access. And the last quick point, there are Jewish Israeli citizens living in the West Bank. Well, they have to travel to Israel in order to vote, as I understand it. They can't vote from the West Bank because that's not Israel. So those are my points.
Well, so many good points are about the issues of loyalty, which again played out in 2013. We'll set up for next time. On that last point, I'm pretty sure that the Israelis, they can vote in the West Bank actually, because they're considered Israeli citizens. I'm pretty sure on that. We'll confirm next time. But on the other religions, yes. This goes back to the place being part of the Ottoman Empire, the land of Israel. And it was the millet system. Every local religious authority gets to run its own affairs. And that's how the status quo agreement grows out of that, for the Orthodox to be in charge. For a Muslim and Christian community, the same thing applies to this day. Basically, that system was inherited, that there are recognized government officials in charge of those communities, which again is so different from our country. We have the separation of church and state. And so, which And going back to where I started, doing all this on Hanukkah is so interesting because Hanukkah often brings up this question about where do we separate church and state? When do we have these public displays of religion on public spaces versus having them in our private homes? And how do we think about that? Is at the core of a lot of what we talked about today. So 2011-05, we'll stop it there. Thank you very much. Again, if you want to stay on for a minute or two, I'm happy to answer any other questions. But our last class, already hard to believe how the time has flown, will be next Sunday. And it's about the present and future of Israeli politics. We'll touch on these issues, the American-Israel relationship, as Yoni said, rising stars in Israeli politics. And any other questions you have, please email us during the week and we'll try to build them in to our last class together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.